Oh, welcome to the recording for Politics and World Unit, and this is the Section B recording. So for Section B, and this is for week 5 for the course, you can see in Section B we're going to start talking about communism. So we'll go into the Class Connect write-up for Section B, and then we'll go through the lesson. So I'll go on down to Politics and the World, which started week 5. And we go down to Section B, Class Connect Write-Up. So there's the Class Connect Write-Up. So you can see we're going to start talking about communism. So we'll go right into the communism unit. Okay, as we start talking about communism, communism is it's a form of government, but it's also an economic system. So it combines both. And the thing about communism, that it started with Karl Marx as the father of communism in the 1800s, and it was a way for, as it says right here, for laborers and the working people to maybe have a little bit of control in their country. That's how it started off. Now today there are really 5 countries that have active communist governments. You can see that right here. North Korea, China, Cuba, Laos, and Vietnam. Vietnam and Laos are all in Asia. Of course, China and North Korea are in Asia also, and Cuba is in the Caribbean, considered part of North America. But there's still a communist party that's active in Russia. There's a communist party in the United States. I mean, there's still communist people out there. So those are the 5 countries that are considered the communist countries today. Let's go back to the Class Connect write-up. So those are the 5 countries that are currently considered communist. Who is considered the father of communism, and what is his most famous writing? So that's on page 2. So if we move ahead, actually it's not on page 2, I think it was on that page 1, but it's probably going to be on page 3 in a second too. But in this section we're going to look at the principles and development of communism, areas of contention and cooperation between China, America, Russia, and America, deterioration and rebuilding of Russia, the impact that Russia and China have had globally, the impact of communist North Korea globally, and the strengths and weaknesses of communism. Now this is just a section warm-up, so you can go in and do this if you'd like to. But you can see what they're going to have you do is to do some keyword search and look at some information about different types of countries on different continents. Okay, so this is page 4, section B, page 4. And this is Karl Marx. And Karl Marx was really the father of communism. And Karl Marx wrote a book called The Communist Manifesto. You can see it down here. The Communist Manifesto is widely heralded as the foundation of modern communism. And what Karl Marx did, you can read in here, he grew up in Germany, was a successful student, became a lawyer, and then he started writing articles about economy and labor. He didn't think that laborers were being treated fairly. And the German government didn't like what he was writing, so he moved to France. And when he got to France, then he really got involved in socialist type of activities. And his socialist thoughts then turned to his stance on communism. So that's how all of this happened. And he wrote this book called The Communist Manifesto, which just talked about the need for communism and what communism could do. And he was, his whole idea was that he was against capitalism and against the way capitalist systems work, because he believed capitalists, where they would exploit workers, meaning taking advantage of workers and things like that. So that's what he wanted to save workers. He was a strong believer in socialism, but he really wanted to, what he really looked at was how to critique and tear down the capitalist system. So if you go back to the Class Connect write-up, so who's considered the father of communism and most famous writing? We did that. Okay. So that was a little bit about Karl Marx, page 4. In page 5, Karl Marx lived the same time that Lincoln did. So Karl Marx wrote a letter to Lincoln. So you can listen to this avatar and hear and learn about what Karl Marx said. You could also go to the script and read the script to find out about that. Here's a discussion. Of course, we're not doing the discussions in this class, but you can see that this is a discussion comparing Thomas Jefferson to Karl Marx. They had some similarities, and obviously they had lots of differences. Hey, communism. So while Karl Marx was busy doing his writing and everything, he met up with Friedrich Engels, and they worked considerably on the manifesto and the ideas of the strength of communism and what communism needs to do. And their attack was, not only on free trade. You can see right here they thought free trade was bad, but there was also laborers are being taken advantage of. So that's what their attacks were on, employers and governments that they felt took advantage of laborers. And the way this all happened is that an upper class started being created in the 1800s, and particularly later in the 1800s. But this upper class, he felt, was taking advantage of the lower class workers. And the upper class is what's called the bourgeois class. Now that's a French word meaning higher class. And he felt that the higher class, they enslaved the workers. And here's what he said: workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. So if I go back to the Class Connect write-up, that's the question I have right here. Translate what he meant. So what I want you to do is interpret what he meant. Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. So interpret that and come up with a sentence or two that explains what that meant. Okay, formation of communism in Russia, so page 8. So looking at page 8, so his ideals weren't very significant except in Russia. In Russia, his ideals were taken by this man. I won't even try to pronounce his name, but he was born in the late 1800s, so you can see 1870. And he changed his name to Lenin because his brother was arrested and hanged for a terrorist bombing plot against the Tsar of Russia. So he changed his name. He called himself Lenin. So Vladimir Lenin was his name. And he wanted to cause a revolution in Russia. So that's what his goal was. And he discovered Karl Marx, so he knew all about Karl Marx and Karl Marx's writing and things like that. So then Lenin he became the father of communism in Russia. So Vladimir Lenin is the father of communism in Russia. Then more about communism. And when Marx wrote about communism, he called the bourgeoisie, the French word for the higher ups, they were the ones that were controlling the workers, and the workers were called the proletariat. And of course, and he says in communism, the proletariat, meaning the workers, will wrest all capital from the bourgeoisie, meaning will take away all the capital of the bourgeoisie. They'll centralize production in the hands of the state, meaning the government control all the production, and increase total productivity for the whole country. So that's what he wanted. He wanted the state or the country to run everything. He assumed that the proletariat, meaning the working class, would assume leadership and bring communism on. And these are all the things about communism. So there'd be no property, land, or rights to inheritance. Heavy taxes. You'd have centralization of banks, meaning a national bank instead of a bunch of banks where you had a choice. The government would control communications and all transportation. Factories and all production would be owned by the government. Equal obligation of all work, meaning that everybody would be required to do the same amount of work. Industrial armies, so you'd have armies of workers, especially in agriculture. You combine agriculture with manufacturing industry, and you abolish the distinction between town and country, meaning that big cities would arise, and big cities, you'd have all the factories in the big cities. Then outside of those big cities, you'd have the country or the smaller communities where all the agriculture would take place. Then free education in all public schools. So those were some of the beliefs of communism. Now if we go back to the Class Connect write-up, it says right here, I'm looking at the list of things on page 9, and actually I think that's page 10. Make a list of which you think are good for the people and which you think are bad for the people. So I'll fix that, but that was that list that we just looked at. Or that is page 9. So look at this list, which are good for the people in general and which are bad for the people. There's a little activity you can do to see what you understand about communism. Okay, page 11. Now we're going to start looking at other countries that are involved in communism. Let's go back to the write-up to see what question it might have. It said, what world event was instrumental in bringing together all of the Soviets to form the Soviet Union? See, after the First World War, there were lots of Soviets, these small independent states, independent countries. You can see there was a Russian Revolution in the early 1900s, and it broke up the Soviet Empire into these. There's some Baltic countries. There was a country called Ukraine, a country called Georgia, a bunch of these small countries, and they were called Soviets. And they had their own. They had their own government and armies and things like that. So there are all these small organizations that were out there, these political unions, so to speak. And then the Soviets, the Russians, Russia was the biggest one, Russia wanted all of them to come together. So Stalin, Joseph Stalin, the leader of Russia, he started trying to get all of these countries together, but he killed thousands and thousands of people. You actually see millions of people at this time, sent people to concentration camps, etc. So Stalin was in control. And then, of course, in the 1940s, the Germans, the Nazi Germans, they attacked Russia. And when they attacked Russia, then all of those small countries galvanized as one communist state. So the Nazi Germany attack on Russia in 1940 brought all of those countries together. So if we go back to the Class Connect write-up, you can see right here, what world event brought all those Soviets together? The Nazis attacking in 1940 brought all of them together. So then after World War II, the Soviet political system got together, and the Soviets, all of these Soviet organizations got together to form one huge communist country. And many people at that time in the world felt that that proved that Soviet politics, that communism was right, because they became really strong. And you can see Soviet Union developed into world power, and they challenged the United States, the democracy, and the capitalism of the United States. So what we had were the two greatest powers in the world after World War II, which was the Soviet Union, called USSR, and the United States. And we were both strong. We had democracy with capitalism. They had a communist form of government and a communist economy. So you can see that we certainly believed in different things. And this competition between us was called a Cold War. Cold because there were no battles, but that was called a Cold War. And if we look down here, although the Cold War ended in the 1990s, there are many things that happened because of the Cold War. Let's take a look at this. You can see that the Miracle on Ice, the upset, the United States beat the Soviet hockey team in 1980. That was huge because it was like the United States against Russia, democracy against communism, and in that case, democracy won out. Even though it wasn't an economic hockey game, it was a real hockey game. Then in 1984, the Soviet or the United States, we boycotted the Moscow Olympics, meaning we did not send any team to the 1984 Olympics. And then in 1988 Olympics back in the United States, the Soviet Union did not send anybody to the U.S. Olympics in 1988 that the U.S. hosted. And then, of course, movies came out, like the Rocky IV was all about Sylvester Stallone fighting a Soviet Russian fighter, and Top Gun and Red Dawn. They're all about the Cold War. So some of these things you might know about. Okay, page 12. So now we're looking at the Cold War. So let's go back to the Class Connect write-up. Okay, explain what the Cold War was and why was it not really a war. What does the Russian government look like today? So this is the Cold War. So during World War II, we were on the same side as the Russians to beat the Nazis out of Germany. And of course, when that happened, then the Soviet Union, the Russians, were the Soviets. They ended up being against us, not in a real war, but in what's called the Cold War. So what the Cold War was, it was a bunch of social, political, and military moves between the Soviet Union and the United States. It went from the end of World War II, which was about 1945, through the 1980s, so almost ran about 40 years. We never had any military conflict, but we were pretty close. So that's what the Cold War was. And at that time, like the Russians, they were spreading communism, so they put communism into East Germany, and they wouldn't let us get supplies into the city of Berlin in Germany, and ultimately Berlin became a split city. One half of Berlin was in West Germany, one half was East Germany, and the Soviet Union controlled East Germany. But West Germany was on the side of the United States. They were a democratic country. Well, then in the 1950s, of course, we already had our hydrogen bomb, our atom bomb. The Soviets exploded a hydrogen bomb. And then we had missiles. Both sides had missiles. The Soviets launched the first satellite into space in the 50s. They put the first man into orbit. So you can see that they really got ahead of us technologically. But then Kennedy, as president, he said no more. And he said, we're going to go to the moon by the end of the 1960s. So Kennedy was the one that led us against the Soviets. But there are lots of things that happened. We nearly came to war with them because of what's called the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. There were lots of issues with that, and we almost launched missiles to the Soviet Union. They almost launched missiles onto us. Now, ultimately, the Soviet Union broke down in the 1990s. Right here you can see the Soviet Union was going into terrible financial collapse. They had a war in Afghanistan that they lost. A lot of their republics, the little countries like Georgia and the Ukraine, those former countries, they wanted to be on their own. They were tired of being controlled by the Soviets. So the country was bankrupt. Then finally the Soviets, they got out of East Berlin, so then Germany reunified, and Ronald Reagan led that. So Germany became a democratic country. So the Soviets were losing all of their power. Then ultimately into the 90s, they ran a terrible economic crunch. All of their small countries, the small Soviets like Georgia and the Ukraine and others, they became independent countries. So Russia was in a terrible decline economically. But then Russia, you can see right here, Russia recovered through market-based economical reforms. With market-based, that means capitalist, just like the United States, very capitalist. So Russia turned to capitalism to bring them out of their Great Depression. And today you can see right here, how is Russia today? The nation has adopted constitutional democracy, meaning they have democracy, they elect presidents just like the United States. They have executive and legislative branches just like the US. They have public elections. They still have a communist party, but it's just one of 10. So this right here, this is what Russia looks like today. Significant changes, and they're one of the powers in the world today. So that's the answer to that to this Class Connect write-up question. So we answered that one. Why was it not really a war? What does the Russian government look like today? We just answered that. Explain the history of the Berlin Wall from the beginning to the end. So now we go to page 13, and page 13 starts talking about the Berlin Wall. And the Berlin Wall, what happened with that? In 1945, the end of World War II, Germany and Berlin were divided into two sections. One was Allied, meaning like the United States, France, Germany. We controlled West Berlin and West Germany, but then the communist government, they controlled East Berlin and East Germany. And the communists put up a huge wall to separate East Germany from West Germany. Millions of East Germans deflected to West Germany to try to get out of there. But before the deflection, I mean, there was lots of different things that happened in East Germany. So Berlin Wall was built in 1961 to keep the East Germans from leaving. So it cut Berlin in two. And that was a big challenge in the Cold War, us against Russia and East Germany and West Germany right there fighting against one another practically. So the Berlin Wall was built in 1961 to separate East Germany from West Germany. But then in 1989, the German economy was really suffering. The East German economy and the Communist Party was thrown out of power, and Ronald Reagan went to the Soviet Union and he said, hey, Soviet Union, because they still controlled East Germany, tear down that wall. So the wall came down in 1989. So it was up for about 28 years. So that's the history of the Berlin Wall, of when it started and when it was finally torn down and the people that were involved in it. Now still, East Germany is divided just in cultures because they still have different types of beliefs, but Germany is all one country now. And they have probably the strongest economy in Europe. Okay, page 14, so let's go to the Class Connect write-up. Okay, explain the status of China's economy today. So, okay, the homework quiz, you don't do those. Okay, China. Now, China, they have been communist for a long time, and but the People's Republic of China, as we call it now, was formed in 1949. And of course, China, their biggest issues back in the 50s and still is how to feed all their population. Their population is just growing so much. So China, mostly an agricultural economy, fed peasant farmers and things like that. And China tried to control all of that. And then China, they entered the Korean War. So they were on the side of North Korea, which was communist. We were on the side of South Korea, which was a democratic government. So then we ended up being at odds with China or against China. So there are all kinds of things that happened between us and China. And ultimately, the Chinese government, I mean, they were killing thousands of people. Even in the 1980s and 90s, the government put martial law into place because the Chinese people, they wanted to have a different kind of economy, a different kind of society. But the Chinese government, they went in with tanks, and the tanks in Tiananmen Square, the tanks ran over people. They crushed all these people. The soldiers shot into the crowds and killed hundreds of people. So those protests made China change a little bit. And now you can see, what China is not so much, it's still communist government, but they've changed dramatically because they know they have the power of all their people. They're an economic power. So China now, and here's what it's like today. China has created a more market-based economy, so it's like a capitalist economy like we have, has become one of the world's largest economic powers. Their government and their private business have expanded their investments worldwide. So China has really grown as a country on the world scale, because they no longer just keep to themselves like they did all the way through the 1950s. Now they are a global economic power and really a military power too. So this is what the Chinese government is all about today, right down here. Okay, page 16, a couple more countries that are communist. North Korea, you read about North Korea in the news every once in a while. And North Korea, so there's North Korea that is communist, South Korea that is democratic, and they're still at war. And there was the Korean War back in the 1950s, but they're officially still at war. No peace treaty's ever been signed. So it's really an interesting thing. North Korea, they have a very strict politics and very strict economy, really a very poor economy, but then South Korea is very, very strong economy. So it's really interesting to have those two countries right next to each other with the two different economies they have. North Korea has also been called a nation that sponsors terrorism. In 2009, just a few years ago, North Korea launched rockets over Japan to land in the Pacific Ocean. So North Korea does a lot of things that the United States and the rest of the world doesn't like. Cuba, another communist country. Of course, Cuba was a big, being controlled by the Soviet Union in the 60s, and that's when we had the Bay of Pigs incident with John F. Kennedy, when the United States tried to invade the Bay of Pigs, and it was a disaster. But that was all part of the Cold War and what was happening with that. And we almost got into a war. You can see right here in 1962, we almost got into a war with the Soviet Union at that time. Then ultimately, things settled down. Now, Cuba still, we have some embargoes against Cuba, meaning we don't allow some of their products in our country. We don't ship some things to them. Cuba is a very poor country, and millions of Cubans come to the United States to be free. And they get on little rafts and little boats, because Cuba's only about 70 miles away from the United States, away from Florida. Okay, Cuban Missile Crisis, that's an assignment you have to do, this web quest. Make sure you get that done. Then page 19, of course, is a communism quiz, and as always, the communism quiz preview here, and then the communism quiz. So that is all of week 4, or week 5, I should say, I'm sorry. So that's week 5. We're wrapped up with the section B recording for week 5. So thanks for listening. I look forward to your work coming in. Bye.